In the days of old, there arose a people whose name struck fear into the hearts of those who heard it, the Vikings. These seafaring warriors, with their mastery of ships and keen understanding of strategy, left an indelible mark on the pages of history. But what fueled their conquests? What set them apart from their contemporaries? It was the Viking way of warfare, intricately entwined with their penchant for raiding, that propelled them across the North Atlantic and into the heart of the Mediterranean during the Viking Age, spanning from the late 8th to the 11th century. Contrary to popular belief, the image of berserkers foaming at the mouth and committing unspeakable atrocities was not the sole reality. The Vikings were no more brutal than their counterparts of the time. Instead, they were driven by a thirst for exploration and the pursuit of wealth. Originating from disparate regions across Scandinavia, Viking warbands operated independently, led by chieftains, earls, and kings. Their hit-and-run tactics, coupled with the establishment of overwintering bases, allowed them to wreak havoc abroad for extended periods, carving out territories far from their Scandinavian homelands. In battle, Vikings wielded an array of weapons, each with its own purpose and significance. Swords, adorned with intricate patterns and symbols, were the prized possessions of wealthy warriors, while axes served as both tools of utility and instruments of war. Short swords, spears, bows, and shields completed their arsenal, with each weapon reflecting the ingenuity and craftsmanship of its maker. But perhaps most intriguing were the Viking helmets, shrouded in myth and misconception. Contrary to popular belief, these helmets were not adorned with horns, but were instead practical in design, offering protection without impeding movement. In the closing years of the 8th century, whispers of Viking raids began to spread like wildfire, tales of plunder and pillage carried on the wind. From the monastery at Lindisfarne to the trading centers of Dorstad, no coastal settlement was safe from their relentless onslaught. Their ships, with their shallow draft and lightning speed, became the stuff of legend, allowing them to strike swiftly and vanish into the mist before any defense could be mustered. Led by kings and earls, these warbands of fierce warriors left a trail of destruction in their wake, their raids growing in both scale and frequency. But it was not just brute force that drove the Vikings to victory. Behind their ferocious exterior lay a keen sense of strategy and cunning. Overwintering in hostile territories, they established bases from which they could launch further campaigns, forging alliances and securing tribute. Yet, even as they expanded their influence across distant lands, the Vikings remained adaptable, their tactics evolving with the changing seasons. From the shield wall formations that dominated the battlefield to the strategic use of archery and mounted messengers, they employed every tool at their disposal to secure victory. Their greatest triumph came with the arrival of the Great Army, a relentless force that swept across England, bringing kingdoms to their knees and reshaping the political landscape. But even as their power reached its zenith, the Vikings knew that their success relied not just on strength of arms, but on the flexibility and opportunism that had guided them from the very beginning. As the fires of conflict raged across the land, the Vikings' mighty army stood poised for battle, their ranks brimming with warriors from across the Scandinavian kingdoms. But how were these vast forces organized, and what drove them to war? In the swirling chaos of battle, the command structure of the Viking armies remained shrouded in mystery. Local kings, earls, and chieftains each led their own warbands, their authority cemented by ties of kinship, personal allegiance, or the promise of plunder. At the Battle of Ashdown, where King Alfred faced the great Danish army, the wings of the opposing forces were led by kings and jarls, each vying for supremacy on the field of battle. Yet, as the Scandinavian kingdoms began to coalesce into more unified entities, the hierarchy within the Viking armies grew more defined. Kings like Sven Forkbeard commanded not just their own personal retinues, but also the crews of several ships, their authority stretching across the seas and beyond. But beneath the surface of this martial order lay a web of connections forged by blood, friendship, and shared purpose. While the term Leithinger hinted at a force directly under the king's control, the reality was far more decentralized. Viking ventures were often private affairs, with warriors drawn together by bonds of camaraderie rather than royal decree. And who were these warriors who answered the call to arms? They were the young men of Scandinavia, drawn to the promise of adventure and glory. While tales of female Viking warriors persist, the evidence remains inconclusive, with most accounts and skeletal remains pointing to a predominantly male fighting force. Yet, as the Vikings embarked on their campaigns of conquest, they drew strength not just from their own ranks but from allies across the seas. From the shores of the southern Baltic to the distant lands of England, their armies were a melting pot of cultures and backgrounds, united by a common thirst for victory. And so, as the banners fluttered in the breeze and the horn sounded the call to arms, the Vikings stood ready to unleash their fury upon the world, driven by ambition, loyalty, and the bonds of brotherhood. As the Viking armies sailed forth, their distinctive features set them apart in the annals of medieval warfare. Yet, beneath the surface, the threads of similarity wove them into the broader tapestry of European conflict. In an era where technological parity prevailed, the Vikings' penchant for raiding and tribute-taking was not an isolated phenomenon. Pre-Viking Ireland and Britain had witnessed similar acts of plunder, and across medieval Europe, kings engaged in tribute negotiations as a central element of diplomacy. Ships, the lifeblood of Viking mobility, were not exclusive to them. The Anglo-Saxons and the Franks too sailed the seas, but the Vikings' mastery lay in the construction of swift, seaworthy vessels with shallow drafts. These ships, not just a means of transportation but weapons of war, epitomized the hit-and-run raids that became their hallmark. Strategic mobility defined their approach, blending the swiftness of ships with the agility of horses on land. Good logistical awareness ensured a steady supply chain on campaigns, while military intelligence and a keen instinct for vulnerable targets set them apart. The fluid structure of individual warbands, each led by a private leader, added to the dynamic nature of Viking warfare. Yet, it was the practice of overwintering that truly distinguished them. Bases established during the colder months became rallying points, launching pads for further conquests in the warmer seasons. To withstand this onslaught, direct confrontation or the payment of tribute offered only temporary relief. Gareth Williams aptly noted that it was only when the twin issues of mobility and supply were tackled that the Viking raids could successfully be contained. Leaders like Charles the Bald of West Francia and Alfred the Great of Wessex recognized the importance of fortified bridges and towns, employing a combination of coastal defense and strategic construction to halt the Viking advance. As the Viking Age unfolded, Scandinavians, wielding swords and commanding mighty ships, left an indelible mark on the canvas of medieval Europe. Their influence stretched like the tendrils of a vast tree, reaching from the North Atlantic to the sun-kissed shores of the Mediterranean, and even as far as the fabled city of Constantinople. In the heart of Byzantium, some Norsemen made a fateful decision to become professional warriors in the service of the emperor. They became the Varangian Guard, a legendary elite corps that stood as a testament to the prowess of Viking warriors. Yet, this image of Vikings as marauding pirates, ruthless and heathen, is one that requires careful consideration. Contemporary accounts, often penned by monks and other targets of Viking raids, tell a tale of outrage and condemnation. The heathens, as they were deemed, attacked churches and slew churchmen, a narrative that fueled the disdain of those who chronicled these events. However, context is essential. In the early raiding years, Viking incursions were sporadic and hardly catastrophic for local institutions. Other rulers, even those professing Christianity, were not strangers to similar acts. The popular depiction of Vikings as wild warriors, savage and brutal, owes more to artistic exaggeration than historical accuracy. Gareth Williams, an authority on the subject, notes that their success on the battlefield was not a result of berserker fury, but rather careful strategies, logistical planning, and a skillful blend of warfare and diplomacy. The famed berserks, with their roaring fury and invulnerability, were more literary constructs than practical battlefield realities. In truth, the Vikings' effectiveness in warfare earned them recognition. Their prowess was not limited to raiding coastal settlements. It reached its zenith as they served in the Byzantine Emperor's Varangian Guard. These warriors, far from mere savages, demonstrated a level of skill and organization that went beyond the romanticized tales. So, as the Vikings sailed into history, their reputation endured, a complex legacy of raiders, warriors, and at times, diplomats. The echoes of their adventures reverberate through time, challenging simplistic narratives and inviting us to delve deeper into the nuanced reality of the Viking Age.